All right, so this is the fifth, fifth home lesson on elements of style. This is the third one we've done on number 3. Okay, number 3 is a big one. Okay, so enclosed parenthetic expressions between commas. We've talked about how doing that means you have to determine whether it's a parenthetic expression or not. And then you also have to listen to the flow of the sentence. If it's a big enough interruption, you want to put a comma or 2 commas separating the interruption. Otherwise, you can keep it as it is in the middle of the sentence. Okay. Last week we talked about non-restrictive and restrictive clauses. So this week there's a little offshoot at the end of this in Elements of Style, okay, the book that we're pulling all of this from, okay, that says when the main clause of a sentence is preceded by a phrase or a subordinate clause, use a comma to set it off. Okay, keyword here is preceded. When it comes before the independent clause, when it comes before the main clause, right? You could also say that means independent. Okay, when a phrase or a clause that is not the main or independent clause begins the sentence, you need to set it off with a comma. Okay, so a shortcut for understanding this is just being able to recognize the words that often begin these kinds of phrases or clauses. Okay, so I'm going to just read a list of words that often begin subordinate clauses. Okay, and then when you see those beginning a sentence, you can probably say, all right, there's going to be a comma somewhere here before the independent clause starts. Okay, so here they are. Okay, some subordinating words, I like to call them. Okay. After, although, as if, as long, because, before, even though, if, in order, since, so that, unless, until, when, whenever, wherever, while. Okay? So obviously, if you need to, you can rewind it and listen to those again. But that's not all of them, but that's sort of the main ones that you'd see. Okay, that's just a hint for you to say, okay, when I see these words begin a sentence, most of the time it means that I'm going to need a comma somewhere in the middle of the sentence, which separates the subordinate clause from the independent clause. Okay, but it could also be a phrase. It could also be an apositive phrase or a participial phrase that begins the sentence, and you need to set it off with a comma then. Okay, so this is all about being able to recognize the independent clause of the sentences you read and the sentences you write. Okay, this is a common mistake in your own writing. So let's take an example. First of all, we could take this actual sentence as an example, right here. The sentence that tells you the rule is an example of the rule itself, because you start the sentence with this word, right? When. That was one of the words I just said, right? So, when the main clause of the sentence is preceded by a phrase or subordinate clause, that whole thing right there is the subordinate clause, right? See the comma? Then you begin the independent clause. Use a comma to set it off. Okay? Now, if I switch this, okay, if I switch the order of this, if I put this independent clause at the beginning, so that it's no longer preceded by this clause, then I don't need a comma. That's the tricky part, okay? So if this sentence said, use a comma to set it off when the main clause of a sentence is preceded by a phrase or subordinate clause, period. No comma. Why? Because the independent clause begins the sentence. If the independent clause, also known as the main clause, begins the sentence, you don't need to set it off from the subordinate clause, right? Because if you think about it, the word subordinate means underneath or like after, right? So if it's after the main clause, it's in the right place. You don't need a comma. If it is before it, you do need a comma because it's it's not out of place, but technically it is, right? So that's why we say you use a comma before or after a subordinate clause that precedes an independent clause. So that's one example, okay? We could take another example that I'll pull out of the book here, okay? Let's see. Let's say, although I did not feel well. I came to class. Okay? So you notice how essentially I have a subordinate clause, although I did not feel well, comma, I came to class. Right? That's correctly punctuated. If I switch it again, I came to class, although I did not feel well, I don't need a comma, because the independent clause comes first. Okay? And we could do this with a phrase as well. So let's say we use a participial phrase. Okay? Struggling, let's see, struggling to stay awake. We'll say I dozed my way through class. So here you don't have a subordinate clause, but you have a participial phrase, again, introducing the main clause, which is I dozed my way through class. Right? So because of it beginning the sentence, you need a comma. Okay? So, coming back to this sentence, this is a very important rule, one that you need to keep in mind whenever you're writing. This is a common mistake. When the main clause of a sentence is preceded by a phrase or a subordinate clause, use a comma to set it off. Again, focusing on that word preceded, because that's the only time where you're going to need to use the comma, if it comes before the main clause.